This green area right here is the occipital bone, labeled number 1. These, labeled number 2, are the parietal bones, separated by the sagittal suture. This yellow part of the skull is the frontal bone, labeled number 3. This orange part, labeled number 4, is the temporal bone. This pink section is labeled 5, and it is the sphenoid bone. 6 is the ethmoid bone, and it can also be seen here. This purple region is known as the maxilla, and it is labeled 7. 8 is the zygomatic bone. 9 is the lacrimal bone. 10 is the nasal bone. This white section is known as the palatine bone, and it is labeled 11. 12 is the vomer, and it can also be seen right here as well. And this gray area right in here is the inferior nasal conchae, conchae. 14 is the lower jaw, also known as the mandible. Now we are going to move to our neck structure, where we can see 15 is labeled, and this is the hyoid bone. This region of the blue puffy paint is labeled 16A, and it is the thyroid cartilage. And right below it, right here labeled 16B, is this cricoid cartilage. And then we have our clavicle and our sternum labeled. If we turn it around, we have our scapula labeled. Now onto the inferior side of the skull, we have labeled 17 as our articula fossa, and this general, sorry for that, but 18 in this general area is the pterygopalatine fossa. It is kind of hard to see on our skull model. And then 19 is going to be the infratemporal fossa. And 22 right here is our canine fossa. This whole general area that includes part of the parietal bone and the temporal bone is the temporal fossa. Again, it is kind of hard to see on our skull model. Back to the inferior view, 21 is going to be the pterygoid fossa. 23 is going to be the coronal suture. Like I said earlier, 24 is the sagittal suture. 25 is going to be the lambdoidal suture. And this suture is labeled 26, and it is known as the squamous suture or squamosal suture. Once again, we are back on the inferior view, and 27 is the median palatine suture, and 28 is going to be the transverse palatine suture. 29 is the temporozygomatic suture, and it separates the temporal and the zygomatic. 30 in between the eyebrow region is known as the glabella. 31 is known as the pharyngeal tubercle, and 32 is known as the hamulus. It can be seen on both sides. This spine right here is known as the spine of the sphenoid, and it is labeled 33. 34 is the mastoid process, and labeled 35 is the styloid process. On the occipital bone, we have 36A, this is the superior nuchal line, and 36B is going to be the inferior nuchal line. 37 labels the external occipital protuberance. 38 is the carotid canal, and 39 is the foramen ovale. And 40 is the foramen lucerum, and 41 is the foramen spinosum. It's hard to see, but 42 is known as the stylomastoid foramen. I put my dot on accident over the actual foramen itself. 43 is the jugular foramen, and 44 is the foramen magnum. And 45, which I think is right here on The hypoglossal canal is supposed to be 45. I don't think we can actually see it on the skull model, but this would be the general area that it is in. 46 is the incisive foramen, and 47 is the greater palatine foramen. 48 is known as the PSA foramen. 49 is the petrotympanic fissure. 50 is the pterygoid canal, right here. 51 is the olfactory foramina. 52 is the optic canal. 53 is the superior orbital fissure. And right below it is 55, which is the foramen rotundum. And below that, we have 39, which is the foramen ovale. And then 41, the foramen spinosum. And then 56 is the internal acoustic meatus. And below that, once again, is the jugular foramen. And 45, this tiny little circle, is the hypoglossal canal. And back on the temporal bone, we have 57 as the external acoustic meatus, and 58 as the sphenopalatine foramen. And this fissure right here labeled 62 is a pterygomaxillary fissure. And back on the mandible, we have 64, which labels the mandibular foramen, which is right there. And then 63 is the mental foramen. And on the frontal bone, we have 34 or 54, which is the supraorbital foramen or notch. And back in the orbit, we can see 53, the superior orbital fissure, as well as 59, which is the nasolacrimal foramen. And way back in the back is the optic canal, labeled 52. And then on the maxilla, we have 60A, which is the infraorbital foramen, 60B, which is the infraorbital canal, and 60C, which is the infraorbital groove.